Today I would like to talk to you a little bit about the literary and social influences on Jane Austen's novels, and then segue into a discussion of the first few pages of Love and Friendship, which you have read for today. In terms of her influences, she was influenced by a very large variety of literary works, ranging all the way back to Shakespeare and beyond. But I would like to focus on the 18th century influences, and I'm going to do it fairly quickly. It's going to be something of a laundry list, but I do want you to at least know these names so that if I mention them later, you will have some idea of what I'm talking about. And of course, some of you possibly have taken an 18th century course, and these names will be more familiar to you, and you might even have read some of the works. First of all, satirists, satire in prose and verse. Jane Austen is obviously a satirist. She's a master parodist, and she learned from various authors. Satire is one of the central literary forms of the 18th century. The two names I want you to remember are Jonathan Swift. If you know that name at all, you probably know it because of Gulliver's Travels, or perhaps A Modest Proposal. And the second name is Alexander Pope, who was a poet and wrote a mock epic called the Dunciad, which was effectively satirically celebrating all the dunces in London. The next genre was periodical essays, as well as magazines and journalism. Periodical essays were essays that were published weekly, bi-weekly, and so forth, that would take particular social or literary topics and reflect on them. I guess they're almost like columns in the newspaper today, though a little bit more elaborate. And there were many, many famous essay series of this kind in the 18th century. The most famous are usually designated or thought to be those by Addison and Steele. The first one was called The Tattler. The second series was called The Spectator. Several essay series by Samuel Johnson, which Jane Austen would have known very well, the most famous probably being The Rambler. There were many more, and in fact Jane Austen's brothers, Henry and James, while they were at St. John's, Oxford, actually were publishing a periodical essay series of their own that was called The Loiterer. Jane Austen also read newspapers and magazines. She was up on current events, current scandals, and so forth. Next up, novels, obviously. One of the dominant forms of the novel in the 18th century was the epistolary form, that is to say, novels in letters. And that is what Love and Friendship clearly is. This form is not really around much anymore these days. It'd be interesting if somebody revived it, but it was a very important form, and I will actually talk to you about a few of those epistolary novels that would have influenced Jane Austen most deeply. What were novels about? They could be about anything, just like today. They could be about voyages, they could be about crime, they could be about romance, sensibility, sex, the Gothic, drawing room comedy, and of course satirical. So you find a wide range of subject matter. But if I had to say one thing that was, if not innovative, at least far more prevalent in the novel, and that grows and grows and grows as the novel grows in importance as a genre, is that it focused more on the middle classes and eventually even on the lower classes, whereas literature of the past had almost always focused on the upper classes, because those were the people who could patronize the authors, could give them money, could give them a position at court, could give them a position as their secretary in their aristocratic household. There was really no market for literature, printed literature, that could support an author until the early 18th century. But by Jane Austen's time there was. And the most dominant social group or social strata in stratum in that hierarchy that bought novels and read them were the middle classes. But it went all the way down to the servant classes, and of course all the way up to the top to the highest levels of titled nobility, and even the monarchy. In any case, certain authors that you will want to remember in terms of specific novelists are, first of all, the women. Women were beginning to write more than ever before in the 18th century, and the genre in which they excelled and proliferated was the novel. I could give you a laundry list of names here, but I'm not going to. I'm going to name one specific person who I believe was the single most important influence on Jane Austen and her writing. And this woman's name is Frances Burney. She used to always be called Fanny Burney because that's what she was called in her lifetime. It was her nickname. Recently, the trends in academia have now dictated that we call her Frances Burney. And she was about 15 years older than Jane Austen, and Jane Austen loved her novels. Now, Frances Burney, wrote novels that were in many ways like Jane Austen's novels. Her most famous novels are, first of all, epistolary. Secondly, they are kind of female Bildungsroman. A young woman, somewhat naive, comes to town or goes to somebody else's estate, whatever, and then is harassed or courted by many young men, gets into many tight situations, commits social faux pas, learns, grows, has funny things happen to her, and in the end, marries the hero. The first novel by Frances Burney, which she published when she was still only a teenager, anonymously, because she thought her dad would get mad if she exposed herself by publishing a novel, not only anonymously, but secretly. He didn't even know that this novel was hers. It was called Evelina, and it was a huge, huge hit. She wrote many afterwards. I'm not going to discuss them right now, but you need to know the name. Frances or Fanny Burney. Among male novelists, I think two were most important. One was Samuel Richardson, who wrote voluminous, meaning big, epistolary novels. And his two most famous are named for their female heroines. The first one is called Pamela. The second is called Clarissa. Both follow the trials and tribulations of young women who, in the first case, are being harassed and almost sexually assaulted by the man that she works for. She's a servant in a high gentry country house and is effectively chased around constantly by her master and has to find ways to fend him off for literally hundreds and hundreds of pages. She's writing home about this or writing to other people about her trials and tribulations. Massive hit, a massive hit. I mean, I don't even know what the equivalent would be today. Harry Potter, something like that. They didn't really have little Pamela dolls, but they came close to that. Second one was called Clarissa, a rather darker novel about a young woman whose family wants her to marry an old, unattractive man who she despises because of the social status and the money, while she is attracted to a witty, seductive rake named Lovelace, who is doing his best to seduce her, or at least to rescue her, and then have his way with her afterwards. This is one of the longest novels ever written, not quite as long as War and Peace, but extremely long as we follow her trials and tribulations. Jane Austen knew these novels intimately, as well as Richardson's third novel called Sir Charles Grandison, which for some reason was her favorite, but I cannot understand why. The second person is Henry Fielding, whose most famous novel is Tom Jones. Very different from Richardson. Fielding is kind of a rake and rambling boy. His hero was a rake and rambling boy. Women can't resist him, and he's so good-natured that he can't say no to them. He travels throughout England, gets in lots of trouble trying to chase after his lover, or not his lover, he hopes she'll be his lover, the girl he loved named Sophia Western, who's been pledged to marry somebody else. And it's satirical, cynical, hilarious, very different than Richardson. Jane Austen kind of combines these forms often in her work. It is not an epistolary novel. It is written third person, and in fact, the authorial voice of Fielding is one of the main characters, as it were, in the novel. All right, finally, in terms of literature, the market. There is finally in England a real market for literature, so you can make a living writing. In the past, the only way to make a living writing was to write and either dedicate to aristocrats, to people with money, and then they would become your patrons, and they would give you money or give you a job at their estate as a secretary, or perhaps give you a place at court. In other words, you were being patronized by someone above who was the person who was going to help you get ahead. There was not enough literate people out there to make it so that you could support yourself by selling your works. The second way is the way Shakespeare did it, which was the right place for a theater you held shares in, and get your plays produced, and then you could generate a fair amount of money that way, though Shakespeare himself also wrote poems that he dedicated to various grandees, various aristocrats, in hopes of winning their patronage as well. By the 18th century, the literary market actually exists. There are enough literate people, and the real change comes with the middle classes. The middle classes are now relatively literate, actually pretty much highly literate, and even the lower middle classes can read. Servant classes can often read, and they're willing to spend money on books, and especially on novels. So this is the status of the literary market, and when Jane Austen finally does decide to take some of her juvenile works and convert them into novels to send out to publishers, and then to write from scratch more novels, she's doing it for one reason, and that is to make money. Earlier, however, in the juvenilia, which we're starting with, she is writing for fun. She writes Love and Friendship when she is only 14, and she's writing it for the amusement of her family, her brothers, her sisters, and so forth. This is the case of all of the juvenilia contained in this work. Lady Susan, toward the end, is on the cusp of being juvenilia, and she actually does, I think, when she goes into it, have in mind the possibility of publication, but then she gets sick of it and just stops, as you'll see when you read Lady Susan. In any case, moving on, I've taken too long with this, but I do want you to at least have some idea before we look more closely in my next video at Love and Friendship. Two things that are really important in Jane Austen in all of her novels. You cannot miss them. One is the relationship of new money generated through trade, through business, or through taking prizes and making money. Taking prizes meaning taking enemy ships and being paid for doing that in the Navy. And these forms of making money and trying to rise in society clash with the landed gentry and the aristocracy, who are longtime owners of their land, who look down on those usurpers who are trying to move up, as it were, and spoil the neighborhood. And Jane Austen goes back and forth in her novels, looking at the various kinds of arguments, disagreements, and situations caused by this new money, the sort of American idea of being able to rise in society, and what we would call, I guess, an Augustan, a more conservative, old school idea that the social hierarchy was planned by God, and you really did not want people moving up or down unless they had some extraordinary talent that allowed them to do that. Again, we will see this again and again. Finally, the marriage market, I don't have to say much about that. If you were a gentlewoman, and what people like to consider themselves gentlewomen all the way down to the lower end of the middle classes, you're not supposed to work. And if you didn't work, then you only had one goal or one profession available to you in your life. And that was to marry well and then be the wife in a relationship with the husband who owned the land or owned the business or owned whatever they owned, and who supported you for the rest of your life. And so Jane Austen obviously is focused on this marriage market, both the good parts of it, but also, I think, in a kind of proto-feminist way, though she's not really overt about this, the predicament in which this puts so many young women. You know this already, I'm sure, but clearly that is, if there's any central topic to all of her works, it has to be the marriage market. One other thing before I stop for today, and I'm going to make another video right after this looking more closely at love and friendship, and that is money. Clearly, Jane Austen is addicted to money. You will notice when you start reading her novels, except for Persuasion, she leads with money. I mean, she practically has an adding machine next to her. She's putting those figures out there because she is kind of obsessed with having money, and we'll talk about why that is later when I give you a more up-to-date continuation of the biography that I began a couple of mini lectures before, prior to this. In any case, you're going to see these things called pounds also often being mentioned. Pounds, 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 pounds. Also shillings and so forth. I'm not going to worry about those now. I'll give you the complete rundown in writing. But you need to know how much a pound is worth in today's American money, in US dollars. So this may be a little high, but I would say basically you can take it to the bank. 1 pound in Jane Austen's period is worth about $150 today. So in a Jane Austen novel, if somebody gives their friend 1 pound, that's like you giving your friend $150. Real easy to do the math in your head on that quickly. 10,000 pounds equals 1.5 million USD. All right, I'm going to stop there for now. I've gone on long enough, but I will be back soon to look in more detail at the opening pages of the hilarious Love and Friendship.